We're going to go ahead and get started today. This is really exciting. I'm so excited to be here. And for everyone, just welcome to the Division on Corrections and Sentencing's 2024 AltAc Rockstar Researcher Webinar Series. I'm Shannon Magnuson. I'm the Director of Influence and Storytelling at Justice System Partners. That's a small nonprofit research and consulting firm that exists in this AltAc space. And I'm one of the co-founders of this DCS series. The Division on Corrections and Sentencing, or DCS, is embedded inside the American Society of Criminology, so ASC, a lot of acronyms here, keeping track of. And DCS brings together traditional scholars, practicing scholars like a lot of us, and practitioners to more effectively think about how we use research and evidence in applied workspaces across the country. As part of DCS, they sponsor this series, which is super exciting, the AltAc Rockstar Research Webinar Series. And this is really dedicated to bringing students and current faculty really closer to the practicing research world, or this kind of alternative academic space, as we prefer to call it. We don't use the term non-academic, and that's intentional because I think a lot of us are traditionally trained academics who take all of the theory and methods that we know and just apply it in cool spaces that aren't a university. Ultimately, the goal is to provide students and faculty a resource that they might not otherwise have and bring connections to you. So that way, should you not have direct connections with folks that are working in these alternative research spaces, that you do now. So before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping things to let you know. The chat feature looks like it's working just fine, so feel free to use it as we're going through the conversation to comment and ask questions. There's also a Q&A feature kind of in the middle of your screen at the bottom bar. You can input all of the questions you have there as well, and you should be able to also upvote any questions that you think are super important and that you definitely want Ellen to answer. And then at the end of the discussion today, we'll return to these questions and make sure that they're all answered. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ashley, to introduce herself and our guest today.
Hi, thank you, Shannon. I'm Ashley Balvender. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Rutgers University School of Criminal Justice. And my area of research interest is parole and probation. I've known since I started the PhD that I want to go into an alternative to academic career, even though I do enjoy teaching. So yeah, that's why for the last year I've been part of the DCS AltAc committee. And I'm really excited to have Dr. Ellen McCann-Sfecla here today. She is a Rutgers alum. She's also been my mentor in the DCS mentorship program, which I highly recommend. They have 2 tracks for academic and AltAc interested students. So yeah, I will give a brief introduction. That Ellen is currently the Director of Research at the Federal Bureau of Prisons. She's had a long career with a lot of interesting and diverse positions and also topics within criminology, from juvenile justice to victimology and corrections. And she is an experienced statistician, unlike myself. She also has worked at some really interesting places, Pew Charitable Trust. She's done work in DC for years now. And yeah, I'm not going to give too much of your background because you will be talking about it. But the first question before we get too far into what you do now is, what kind of sparked your interest originally in criminology and where your path started in the field?
Well, that's a great place to start, and welcome everyone. I'm so flattered that so many folks were interested in attending and that I get to share my story with folks, because I tend to only get to have these conversations with people in places that I'm connected with, like Rutgers. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to other folks. Number one, because in graduate school, they don't necessarily expose you to this information because you're learning from people who are in academia. And it's not because they don't want to give it to you. It's because they don't necessarily have an experience that will help you get there. So, had some great mentors myself. But the spark really came for me at some point in my master's when I was, like everyone else, a broke graduate student and said yes to everything. Every project, every anything that came my way, I said yes. And I had a professor who knew I was pretty good on data entry because it was the 90s and the internet was budding. He knew I was good at the data. And um, he wanted to know if I wanted to help with a project, and it was in victimology, which I barely could spell. And I was excited about the opportunity to do something new because I wanted to say yes to everything because I didn't know what area I wanted to work in. And it was an amazing experience from a great mentor in my master's. And I ended up doing my master's thesis on the topic, and it was sexual victimization. He had been doing a 23 country survey of college students, and I ended up doing my master's thesis on the US cohort that he had done for that data pull. So I used a piece of it, and he did a much larger, big thing. And he was like, in the World Society of Victimology, I'm like, what is this thing you speak of? So for me, it was just this forgotten group of people when we talk about criminal justice and never really thinking about victim justice and focusing our system in one direction rather than another. Um, but when I left there and went on to do my PhD, I found that there weren't anyone else studying that. There was nobody that was really going to help me continue that interest. And I had already had some interest in other things around the criminology and the criminal justice space and learning the difference between the two. So I found ways later to continue to feed those itches that I had to do some of these areas while still being able to work and make a difference in the world for everyone impacted by crime, on the whole gamut rather than just one side or the other. It's probably a good place to stop.
Great. Yeah. And I'm guessing that is really what got you started on your research path and wanting to do your own research. And once you got into the PhD, maybe how did you go about getting research experience? Did you TA or did you mostly do research assistantships?
Yes. All of that, yes. I did anything they would hand me. I went and taught at other universities to make money. So I was a full-time lecturer at the College of New Jersey while I was a PhD student at Rutgers Newark, and then I would pick up adjuncting at New Brunswick because I didn't know how much I was going to love teaching. Like, it ended up being really fun and invigorating and exciting, and it kept me on my toes. And I had to know the material well enough to explain it 3 or 4 different ways. You can't just go in the room and give it the one way. That doesn't show understanding, and it doesn't help them get it. And it just really it spoke to me. But I also knew that I needed to figure out my path so that I could do the research that I believed in. And for me, that meant doing things that were going to change the world around me, and doing things that would improve, for people who didn't have the voice or the education or the opportunity that I was both privileged and lucky enough to have at times. Hard work only accounts for so much. And so I knew, where I grew up, right outside of Newark, New Jersey, I had seen a lot and was affected by it, but not in the same way as a lot of people. And so I knew that there had to be a way that I could help. And that the people we saw as victims weren't the only people impacted by crime, and they weren't the only victims. There are plenty of people that find themselves on both sides of that conversation. So I realized that, the research I wanted to do for a living was going to be the thing that could make the biggest impact for the biggest number of people. And Yeah. So how did I make that happen? Again, saying yes to everything. So I also knew one of the professors at Rutgers when I arrived there because of data work I had done somewhere else on a project. I had reached out to Dr. Vasey, because at the time, 98, I think, 99, she was the only one doing work on this particular data set that someone else knew her. So I reached out to her. So when I arrived, she knew I was a data geek and started telling other professors, hey, if you need some help with something, call Ellen and she'll help you out. And so I did all kinds of stuff, until I really just sort of fell into something. It was definitely serendipitous. I ended up working on contract for the Annie E. Casey Foundation while I was finishing my PhD at Newark. And that job was a detention specialist. But essentially, what we were doing was the state of New Jersey had gotten grant money from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, which is out of Maryland. They do a lot of work around youth and children, but juvenile justice is a whole branch for them. And the state employed a bunch of us people, like myself. There were 5 of us, I believe, when we got started. And we were doing detention reform in juvenile justice systems, and we were mirroring what was going on all over the country. And so while I was at school doing this very academic, very theoretically driven stuff, I realized that there was like this whole bunch of people that were part of this system I was studying that I knew nothing about their experience, their daily, their anything. And so I would sit around a table in Newark in the courthouse in Essex County. It's the busiest courthouse in the state. And I would sit around a table, and there was the head of the family court judge. There was the head of the family court administrator. There were the probation officers that processed cases as they came in at 2 a.m. Should we put this kid in detention? Well, do they come from a good home? And the questions they were asking sometimes were right and sometimes were wrong. And I would bring them data every month instead of waiting. Instead of saying, well, in the last 10 years, here's what happened, we would actually go in on the regular and talk about what happened this month and how is this changing. And wait, this trend is starting to go in a direction we're not happy about. We would have police officers sit down with young people who had been in our system and talk about the reasons why things were happening. We found that kids were getting a high rate of resisting arrest charges at one point, and it was starting to climb up at this one point. So we had some young people who were willing to come and talk to the group. And we had police officers that came and talked to the group. And we came to realize that they just didn't understand each other. They weren't speaking the same language. And we developed a series of community education programs that were taught by both police officers as well as people from the community on how to show one another respect and social expectations. And within 6 months, these numbers came down. People were still getting in trouble, please don't get me wrong, but you didn't have these tack on offenses of resisting arrest because someone didn't know how to show respect to the police officer, and the police officer felt disrespected and even physically harassed, right? So it's just sometimes seeing what you're doing when it affects a person right in front of you that makes you say, whoa, wait a minute. I could write an article that people might read, which is lovely, and it impacts the thinking and the bigger picture. And that's a big way to make a big change. But I like seeing the change. I like seeing what I'm doing. And so for me, that's what I needed. And I realized it very quickly. And in that time, I have never published a journal article in my career. I've never done it. I have put together lots of 100-page PowerPoint presentations for governor's offices, but I have never done anything like that. Lots of government reports. Lots of things like that. But for me, the reward came from being able to know that if I did A, I would see B. And that I had to ask people who knew a lot better than I did what it was like to be in that probation chair or to be the young person on the street, because I didn't have all of those experiences. It was really cool. Wow, that was a very long answer.
No, that's amazing. That's great and very helpful, I think. Was there a tension when you graduated, you went to work for Pew Charitable Trust, but was there a tension between knowing you wanted to do this kind of work and also your love for teaching, that experience you had?
I don't know if tension is the word I would use, but not a bad question. I think I would call it complementary. It became that way for me because as much as I love teaching, I knew I could always do that. Not in the same way that someone who is a full academic does, because I don't want to discount the amount of work that goes into that. But because I could continue being an adjunct if that was an itch I needed to scratch, right? And so for me, during graduate school, when I picked up courses, I tended to teach undergraduate courses in whatever no one else wanted to teach. And so I would get very, very deep into topics that no one really knew enough about or wanted to. I would teach research methods, anyone who asked, because who wants to teach that? So I would do that, and I continued to adjunct until the last year or two of COVID, when I just kind of got sad about not being in person with people, and it just wasn't the same, and I wasn't getting my own reward out of it, and I also didn't know that the students were. And I felt like they were missing out on what they were paying for, because that's good money you're paying. That broke college student thing again. But as a PhD in the field doing this work, I actually found the opportunity to teach graduate courses, which to me can be just as rewarding because of the thinking and the challenge that it presents a professor. Because as you move from high school, where everything's black and white, and then college, where it's gray, you get to graduate school where it's like a rainbow of possible answers you could give to any question. And you are challenged by your students as much as you're challenging them. And so to me, it made me keep up on the most recent research when I could have sat and gotten stale in an office somewhere, much the same way that a full-time professor does. Not the stale part, the staying up part. So it was good for me. I hope that it was good for the students. I have quite a few students I still keep in touch with. They've gotten married, they've gotten PhDs, they're doing their lives. And some of them I'm on Facebook with, some of them I've been to their weddings, just because, sometimes you have the opportunity to come across someone is going to do something big, and you get to be part of that. And that's something I don't have anymore. And so I keep up with my old students like Ashley, who wasn't my student, but as a mentee, I hope to continue to watch what she's going to do, because I know it'll be big. And just knowing that you had a hand in that is amazing. And I still reach back to my professors once in a while and say, hey, I don't know if you remember me. I'll have a reason to think of someone, and I reach out to them. So the education side of our work is incredibly important and cannot be understated. It's just a different choice.
That's really helpful, I think, for those of us who do really enjoy teaching, but also know that it's not necessarily what we want to do as a full-time faculty member. So you worked at a think tank, you worked at Pew, a think tank, and you worked for the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, which is more of a community-based organization, and you worked for the Alliance for Safety and Justice, which is more advocacy. So can you talk a little bit about these different spaces within the AltAc world?
Oh boy. Well, I think that for folks in our audience, and I can't see everybody's names or locations at the moment, but for the people in our audience that are thinking about wandering into this space, if you aren't already, I would say that what I did was less deliberate, but definitely serendipitous, because I had the ability to kind of sample from different perspectives on this work to see which one I felt was the most effective way for me to have an impact, and B, which one I felt was the best fit for me. From big think tank Pew to city government with the CJCC community, where I even did research on homicide, which was never one of my areas, but I was the methodologist on staff. And they were like, well, if we're going to trust anyone, it's going to be you, even if you don't know homicide. Gave me nightmares. But, to see the impact I could have from that chair was very different from sitting at a chair in Pew and calling a governor's office and them saying, oh, Pew, hang on. And they put you through. The kind of juice you have, the kind of impact you have, it's you have to find the place where you feel you can be the most impactful. When I went to the advocacy organization ASJ, I learned an awful lot about what I thought I already knew a lot about. And that was how to get people to hear your message. And that was something that I took from there and learned from there, because for them, the voice of the message was sometimes more important than the message itself. And that can be very useful in really affecting change in this space, because so many people are emotionally attached to our field and don't have the academic knowledge, the statistical knowledge, the research knowledge, but you still have to be able to communicate your purpose and the reason why the position you're taking is something that they should get behind. If in fact that's the case, right? Follow the knowledge, but you have to trust the person with the knowledge. How do you get them to trust you? And now at the Bureau of Prisons, I actually feel like I have made my way around the different areas I could touch and found the one where I feel like I am in the right chair. And I've taken what I learned in those other places, and it really helped me be appropriate to this chair. It's the right chair. You know, I remember going and presenting findings on a homicide study to a community group when I was working in DC government. And I talked about the cases and the people who had committed the offenses and had been convicted for those crimes. And there were people at the table who had lost people. And I lost sight of that. And so the way I used language wasn't perfect. And that happens. But I had to be smart enough to know I didn't know everything and be humble about it, because you could go from a room of policymakers where they need to hear the message about what's the best way to reduce the most injury. And then you go into a different room where you need to make sure that the people who have suffered a loss don't hear you talking about cases, they hear you talking about people. And so learning that lesson kind of really prepared me for these other places I've been. I have so many of those anecdotes where I've learned a lesson about my own message, and hopefully I'm able to teach that same thing to other folks and help mentor them to be aware of their audience when I wasn't always. But yeah.
Yeah, like Shannon said, remembering the humanity. And also, I like your point about humility, because that is very important as well, whether you're in academia or in AltAc space. In terms of research topics and methodology, have the experiences been different in terms of, in those different spaces, in terms of the ability to choose the topics you work on, and also like whether it was important to be a methodologist versus like more of a generalist?
Okay. I want to make sure I answer the whole question, so I'm making a note because I'm not sure that I have been. I'd say, as far as choosing the topics you work on and forming your path, I think that comes from more deliberately being sure you are in those places that value the area you want to work in. When I went over to Pew, I knew that I would be working fully in an area that I felt comfortable in, I felt effective in, and I felt effective. And that was in the juvenile justice space, because I had just come from 5 years of working at Annie A. Casey while I was doing my PhD. So when I finished in 2012, I had already been working in this space for some time. And so when I went to Pew, I could be more deliberate about making sure that the agenda that I was working towards was one that I already felt some specialization in. I knew that system well enough, the terminology, the voice, the issues that you can have, and the ones that we should be tackling. When I went to DC government, as I mentioned, they were like, well, you're the methodologist. So I knew that there were times in my path where I wasn't always going to stay specifically on the thing I wanted to be doing, but I could stay relevant and valuable and have an impact as long as I was willing to step back and be a generalist when I needed to be, because I still had the ability to impact juvenile justice and corrections, but I also had to be willing to do some of the other stuff. And it also, as we all know in this field, none of these things operates in a vacuum. So if you understand the issues that people involved in the correctional system are facing, you probably have a pretty good understanding of the issues that people face in probation or parole, or the issues people face when they're dealing with jail or a court, because they are all similar. Or you could even talk about the social correlates of health, and they're the same list, right? So being a methodologist is not, and sometimes a generalist, is not disingenuous, because in our field it is all interrelated. And you always have the ability, as you work through your career, to come back to those specializations when you're ready to. One of the positions I held was when I was at ASJ, I was doing less of the methodological kinds of research. And so while I worked there, I also did consulting work for former classmates or colleagues that I knew that were doing consulting and said, hey, do you have any projects on topics that you think I'd be helpful with? Are there any things you don't have the bandwidth for right now? And I was able to engage in some victimology work and some stuff on violence interruption and qualitative work, which I had stepped away from. And it was really good for me to kind of really get my research itch scratched, because I was working at a much more advocacy heavy place, and still be able to feel like I was doing something in the field I cared so much about. So it allowed me to do victimology work. And one of the other things I remember I did while I was at ASJ was also picking up work on essentially something resembling grant writing, but it wasn't grant writing. It was contract and procurement kind of writing. It's hard to explain, for the Library of Congress on victimology topics because of my work in that field. So it was really, you just have to be creative in finding those outlets for your goals. I remember having a very deliberate conversation with my partner about, are the things I am doing right now moving me closer to the goals I have for my career? And it helped me make better choices when I had a partner, and you can talk to a friend or a mentor or a professor about those things. Make sure you're having those conversations. Are all the things I'm doing right now? I'm a skilled person. Am I bartending? Am I Ubering? Those things are great, but they're not necessarily going to help you work towards that goal and the career that you hope to have when you look back and say, what did I do? And who did I impact? And how did I feel about it? So I do think that there's room for being a methodologist. There's room for being a specialist. There's room for being a generalist. One of the things, like where I am now at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, is that we frequently interview people for positions as social science research analysts or statisticians or management analysts. And they very much think that when they arrive somewhere like BOP, that they'll be like, oh, well, now here's an interesting topic that I come in with specialty area on, and I'd love to do research on this. Can I go in here, shut a door, and do that? And the answer is absolutely not. We are an operational place. We have the care of over 150,000 people. And as much as it would be neat to do some of the things like that, that makes up a very small portion of how we spend our time. We do a lot of work to try and make sure that the agency is best practices and admit when we're not. Getting people to admit when they're not doing right, knowing their humility and being willing to be wrong is the mark of a smart person. And making sure that people in your agency know that it's okay to be wrong, that if you ask for the information, I'm going to give it to you, but you might not like what it says, and helping them find the solution. It's really cool. And if you have an interest in sex offenders and you are working on our team and there is a project around sex offenders or a need for an evaluation or something to that effect, then hopefully we can work with you to funnel you into that, or that work to funnel into you. But that will definitely not be the only thing you're doing. It just doesn't work that way in an operational agency. And I think that you would find that in most of DOJ. For most of the jobs across it, you don't always get to do the thing you care the most about, but at least get to do it some of the time, and that makes you happy.
I have so many questions I want to ask, and we'll next talk more about your work at BOP, but I just wanted to kind of follow up on the idea of methodology and also like knowing the space you want to end up in, because I think it's an important point. And you seem to love the side hustle, but I like that you always are doing it in a space that is adding to your career in some way. So for students who are in a university where a lot of the faculty and their advisees are maybe don't have the experience or tools to talk a lot about going into an alternative to academic job market, when students are entering the job market and they're thinking about, maybe I'm not a statistician, I'm more of a generalist, or, open to a lot of different topics or areas, or maybe aren't sure the type of agency that they want to work at. Do you have any advice for how students might kind of brand themselves, or if it's okay to brand yourself as a generalist, or if it's important to know the exact, to market the exact area of research you want to go into?
I guess I'm going to give a bad answer and say it depends. That's the bad answer. It's unpopular. I mean, uh, for example, for government work, I think that you will find that the job may be listed as a very specific area. NIJ has been working very hard to try and hire someone uh, to oversee grant funded work for tribal populations. And they've been trying very hard to find someone who has certain areas of criminology and criminal justice expertise, but also has heritage that they can speak to that population from personal experience. And so they've been struggling really hard. And that is an example of a very narrow, what they're looking for, right? For those of you who are looking and this describes you, they have not had any luck. They keep continuing to advertise this. And it's the first time I've ever seen NIJ post a job fully remote because they're afraid that's the only way they're going to be able to find someone. And it's a reality. But there are other times where if you go in too hard and too narrow, that they're going to be like, you're definitely not what we're looking for. You know, when you look for jobs like we hold social science research analyst jobs, that can be used to describe all manner of things around social science. And people in my division, my team, I have industrial organizational psychologists, people with degrees in social psychology. I've got a couple people with MSWs. It's that they are bringing different kinds of experience and expertise with them. One of the big things I think you'll find the most in government is much more quantitative work when it comes to the applied kinds of work, like in my division, but in other places where they are doing more theoretical work, um, such as NIJ, for example, they do have a lot of applied work, but they also have a larger theoretical space. You can go in there with a much more broad base of things that you're good at and really market yourself hard that way. It's such a difficult thing to answer. Yeah, a willingness to learn, number one, because if you're at Rutgers, you're probably an SPSS person. If you're at I don't know, UVA, maybe you're doing Stata. A lot of places are in R now, but if you see a job and they list that here are the packages we use, and that's not your package, you go into that interview or that application and you say willing to learn, because a statistical package shouldn't limit what you can do for a living. And you're already showing that you're willing to learn because you have the graduate degrees that you have and the things and the study. So it's not like you can't learn it. Those are just programs. How you use it is your brain, right? A willingness to learn is huge. Yeah, I don't know if I have a better answer.
No,
Sorry.
that's great. That's very helpful and comforting to hear. And one piece of advice that you gave me that I really appreciate is looking at if you meet or see someone who has a position that really interests you, to go look at their LinkedIn, look at their resume, and try to get those experiences. That has been an incredibly helpful piece of advice. So turning to, because I know everybody wants to know about the Federal Bureau of Prisons, can you talk a little bit about the research agenda and maybe some examples of specific work that you've done?
Great, happy to. And I won't get too detailed or I could lose my job, but I can say that the big reason I wanted to get my PhD was to have a voice in the research I did and the path I followed. And what I realized after arriving in the Beltway, DC, for those of you who don't know what that reference is, when I arrived in the Beltway to about halfway since 5 or 6 years ago was the halfway point-ish. I would say I realized that I wanted a voice in the research agenda that I was working on, not just to do the research, but also to have a voice because that guides where the field goes. It allows you to influence what other people work on too. So to me, being able to do the work, but also to orchestrate a bit was really important in my vision for what impact I wanted to have on the world. We all arrived in criminal justice for lots of reasons. Everybody on this call, everyone we'll ever see in a classroom, we all came here for a different reason, very different from other fields, right? We all have a different passion around it, a different purpose, a different experience that we remember that perhaps brought us to this. But oh boy, it's that research agenda is so important. So for me, with BOP, when I arrived there, I realized that while I was going to be one author, I would have to be one of many. Your ability to collaborate and hear what isn't being said helps you to be able to author that. So for me, the research agenda is not my own, but it is one I absolutely can get behind. So one of the things I have done since arriving there 2 years ago is worked with different divisions that have different purposes across the agency to try and understand what questions they have that are unanswered. Because if my job is to help the agency to engage in best practices, the only way to do that is to examine current practice and see where it's falling short and where it's meeting that. Now, to me, that's the perfect research agenda. Because if we see in the media, which I could talk about all day, what you see about FBOP in the media, you'll see that there are some bad things that happen and there's some good things that happen. We have college programs that are starting to really get off the ground. I mean, Pell's been back for a while, but it's really just starting to take hold. You see work from Vera coming out right now on that, and NIJ is pushing out some stuff. And so when those programs get put in place, you need to evaluate them. That's a huge thing I've always felt very important and a lot of value about the value of an education that we know. It's one of the few things we absolutely know helps with reentry, jobs, education, family. And if we can help study those things and help the people doing that program at that facility or the other 121 facilities to do a better education program, that's the research agenda. If they don't have an answer to that, I can help them do that. If we look at a facility that recently closed and we say, well, what led to that? We can work with our internal teams to try and answer that question to keep it from happening again. That's scary. It's amazing how the research agenda really happens, because to me, all of these things matter. My own interest areas, such as young adult offenders, victimology, trauma, the kinds of things you see frequently in people that are on both sides of victim and convicted, those things are pervasive in our populations. How do we get to a place where we can help that, go forward in a better way? And you do that with a smart research agenda that I can't create in a vacuum. I have to do that with my partners that have experienced being a correctional worker or a psychology program director, or those people who have seen the inside of a facility for many, many years from a variety of seats. I haven't had that experience. So when I go and present our findings on something to our director or our executive team, I don't do that alone. I do the research part. And then there is someone who actually is the subject matter expert on the program we've evaluated, and they talk about it from an experience part. Because research does not live in a vacuum. Research is about explaining as much variation as we can, but we know there's always exceptions to that because we're talking about human beings. Day one research methods class, right? So we have to accept that it's never going to be 100% certain that this person has a high risk level or that person belongs in a drug program and they're going to do well. But we can do our best and then say we fill in the water between the rocks with the experiential knowledge that someone else that's another type of subject matter expert brings. Know that you don't know everything, right? That's been my message all afternoon. But be willing to admit it, do it early and often, and then you'll have colleagues that you're working with and not people who see you as someone in the ivory tower that's telling them what they're doing wrong, because they're not going to listen. You're not going to make any change. But so the research agenda has to be responsive to where you are, the questions that are being asked, And that's why there's value in finding yourself in a place where you can really make an impact in areas you care about, because you know that's the questions that are coming. It really helps you get there. So what we've been doing and what my team has been doing is working to develop research agendas, like several, right? You know, those that respond to our staffing needs, because we are in a staffing crisis, those that respond to our needs around institutional dysfunction, culture problems that are pervasive across corrections, not just FBOP. I'll go to the conferences and listen to what we know the most recently, and I'll bring it back and say, here's what I heard. I know you guys over in HR know this about staffing, and you guys over in psychology services know this about staff self-harm. Let's look at what the research is just now talking about, and let's try and come up with a strategy together. And it's amazing. They're listening, but they have to see you as a colleague. You can't just tell them what they're doing wrong. I hope that
Yeah,
answers the question.
yes, it does. And just to follow up on that, how do you balance, or I should say, there are seemingly a lot of stakeholders involved in the work that you do, and that can sometimes be subject to change in federal work. Can you talk a little bit about how you balance those kind of maybe competing needs or interests? And also, like, if that impacts your day-to-day work or the stability of your work, maybe some of these governmental changes that can happen.
I think it's not always easy. I think some of the things I've touched on probably apply here, like knowing your audience and the context of your work, understanding the questions as well as what's not being said. You know, during one iteration, I'll say iteration, during one iteration of your work, you may find that you have executives and stakeholders from outside of your organization that are interested in hearing all about the things we can fix. And then under another iteration, you may find that, you know, people are less willing to admit problematic areas. And so you have to find other ways to fix them. Some of it is about being creative. Some of it is about endurance, you know, sticking it out and doing what you can with what you have. I think some of what I learned when I was at Pew actually was how to take the successes that you get and know that you wanted all this stuff. It's like when you wrote a dissertation, for those of you who have done one, or are putting it off or trying to finish it, and you're just not there, and God, I can't finish. A done dissertation is a good dissertation, right? That's about taking the successes you can handle today, knowing that your dissertation could have changed the world, but it didn't have to for you to graduate. So that's the first time you're learning to take the small successes and realize there's more you can build later. Take today what you can get. And so when I was at Pew, I learned that because we worked in states that were blue and red and purple, and states that didn't know what they were. And you had to meet them where they were in order to make a real change in the world, and accept that sometimes you weren't going to reduce the penalty for certain drug offenses, but you were going to change the felony theft threshold. And political wins do that, but at least you got one of them. You know, and I feel like that applies in a lot of public facing work like this, whether it's nonprofit or think tank or government, that you take the wins you can get. Sorry, the chat's making me laugh.
Yeah, I think creativity is, I really like to hear that, because it's not something that we're always encouraged, or we might not be as encouraged to think about in graduate school. Some other things are sometimes we put more pressure on ourselves to do it right and conform to the literature, or not necessarily always thinking creatively. So I think it's time to turn it over to Q&A. So should I turn it over to you, Shannon, to facilitate?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you've actually I think one of the things that, you've been talking about that I think is really kind of spot on to some of the questions are really, someone asked, how do you help decide which programs are evidence-based and what does that look like? And then, ask the second question about, that there's been research recently done assessing the evidence base of all programs, and kind of, do you think these kinds of things will ever be publicly released? And I think one thing that I was thinking about as you were talking, Ellen, was that oftentimes for scientists like yourself and others who move into city, county, and state government spaces doing really thoughtful research, that research is somewhat proprietary to the government, and that not all of it is publicly released, right? And that you're answering questions, your client is yourself. And the goal is certainly to be financially responsible with local, state, federal funds, in pursuit of taxpayer dollars, right? And so I think it's interesting to also be working, knowing that when you work, particularly in government spaces, that some of the work that you do cannot be public. I think that's also true for proprietary research that happens in technology spaces, and in corporate research spaces. And so I just want to, to answer this person's question is, as the director, how do you help decide which programs are evidence-based, and how do things, what things are public, what things are not public of the research that you're doing?
Well, to the evidence-based part, we'll start there, and then we'll talk about the public part, because those are kind of separate. The evidence-based, when we talk about that, we all mean one thing, but the person you're talking to might mean something else. And so in federal government and in state government and city government, you are doing what the legislation requires you to do frequently. So for us, it's the First Step Act has been dictating a great deal of our work since it passed in December of 2018. And it requires that we have evidence-based recidivism reduction programs, and that we evaluate programs to determine whether or not they're actually reducing recidivism. What you will find online, if you're interested, you can go to our website. You can see the current list of programs being offered. There's over 100. It changes occasionally. My division isn't in charge of that. There's the Reentry Services Division does that, and we help them. So we do evaluations with them as the subject matter experts. We can run the analysis and do the methodology, and then talk to them about how we interpret those findings. But those findings are interpreted as, okay, evidence-based of what? Because when you go out and look for research that supports CBT or FFT, they're frequently talking about improving functioning or cognition, improving employability. They're not talking about recidivism reduction. And so there isn't a whole lot of research out there that talks about evidence of recidivism reduction, even though they're evidence-based on evidence of what, right? So it's a difficult conversation, because the legislation says we got to do this evidence-based thing, but they're not as informed as we are about what that means. And they're in charge. So we have to answer that question. As far as what becomes, that was my rant for the day.
No, and I think you're right. I think your point is well heard too, is that as we're researchers in these applied spaces, being really critical and thoughtful of the questions that we're asking, of like, what is the outcome, right? In your space, the outcome of interest might actually be misconduct reduction, right? And the reality is that the evidence base could actually be measuring rearrest or reconviction or reincarceration, none of which are misconduct reduction. And so I think it's well heard that as your researchers working in this space too, that we're really thoughtful about what it is that we're measuring, and then being really careful and thoughtful about how we're labeling things evidence-based, when in reality, I think what we really mean is evidence-informed.
Yes. Well said. Well said. When it comes to making findings public, I think that we are frequently in government, whether you're talking about my agency or any other, you are very much at the will of what your agency is currently dealing with. So one of the things that we have worked very hard to do in the last couple of years is to get some goodwill and have people see that we are doing work to make sure that we are improving our practices at every opportunity. We've published our first articles since 2016, this past month. We have a newsletter that's now coming out on our website that tells you what we're working on right now. We did a white paper on the impact CARES Act had when we sent people to home confinement earlier than we normally would have, if they were in health compromised categories as well as low risk and certain categories of offenses. We did that, and the analysis was as good as we could make it. Stuff that wouldn't go into a journal because it doesn't hit the top, but we used what we had, right? And so not all of the work we do in government can make it into a journal. Mostly there's no theory there. It's about, here's what we did. And so a lot of journals are looking for more theoretically based work. So we don't always fit there. But I'm trying to find opportunities for us to push our work out for people to know what we're doing, even when it doesn't get to that level. And so that's what we've been able to accomplish, at least in the last couple of years. We're also working on partnerships with other agencies to try and leverage the kinds of information that we don't have versus what we do have. Like census can tell you all about, or IRS can tell you all about people's employability or their income and those sorts of things. How do you tie that to our data? Well, how do we do it legally? Because legislatively, we're not allowed to follow people after they leave. Like, the only thing we can do is look at the recidivism data, and it's not even ours. We have to buy it, right? Not buy it. We have a contract where we do pay for the services of, but sorry, it sounded bad. But we have to attain that data from somewhere else. It's one of the reasons why BOP still using rearrest as our measure of recidivism, because the reconviction data isn't there yet. It's not good enough yet, but we're working on it because we want to have tools that are less biased, and we want to have good and accurate measures of human behavior and not just system action, right? So we're trying to get people to see the value in asking the right questions. And if they ask them to us publicly, we can answer them publicly too. The CARES Act analysis came from that. There was a stakeholder that asked a question during a forum, and the powers that be heard them ask it. So we were like, oh, we can totally do that. And so we did, and then we put it out, and it was wonderful. So asking the right questions in the right forums helps us do that as well. There's a lot of ways this can work. So to the fact that we haven't, pushed out much evaluation research since the century began, we're working to change that. Some of it is capacity, some of it is trust, some of it is, information. It takes years to do any analysis. Yeah, that's what I got.
I think I appreciate that. And I really appreciate the commentary, right? Of also, when we are able to publish this, that it goes in some journals and not others. And I think that's true of all researchers, even more traditional academics who are working in university settings where they have something that's heavy theoretically or not, and they're also making these negotiations. But I think it's true that in applied setting, the work is so grounded in the context of the place that theory is there to maybe be your starting point, but it generally is not your end point. And it's generally not theory per se that's explaining your findings, but much rather the context of the place. And I think that's another kind of differentiator between kind of these more traditional spaces and these applied spaces, is really that there is a real need. And I think you talked about this earlier, humility to walk into spaces and think about context and know that the people who work in those spaces, who are navigating those spaces, who are impacted by them broadly and specifically, that you live and lean into their lived expertise of the context to then inform how you analyze your data, even the outcomes you might come up with or don't come up with, right? And then how you kind of put those findings together with the implications is really grounded by the context and not necessarily by the theory. I think that's a really thoughtful differentiator too. I think with, a few minutes left, I think one of the questions that I had as I was listening to you too is that, like, as somebody who leads this department and lots of researchers, it sounds, with lots of interdisciplinary backgrounds, which is amazing and awesome, and I love that. Then if you really can walk into this space coming from any background and just being generally curious and probably have some technical skills, what are things that you're looking for as a leader of this organization when you're hiring people? And what are you okay with them growing into? And what would you like them to have kind of walking in the door?
Hmm. I think what I'd say, there's a lot of answers to that question. I think people who are willing to learn, which we've already talked about, people who are creative, which we've talked about in other ways, people who are self-starters and learners and doers. I had someone show up today who doesn't start for 2 weeks. She just wanted to see where the office was to make sure she'd be able to get there for her first day. And I was there, so I brought her in. I was like, hey, meet everybody that's here today. It was great. And I am so glad that we made her a job offer. And it cemented for me that this is someone who's going to go out there and find it. If there are ways for you to show that in an interview, that is huge. I think that in government, we have a tendency to have a lot of people that want to come work in government that want to change the world. And I think that that whole accept the success as you have stuff is really important when you enter our space. Because when we have people that we interview and we're like, well, what do you see yourself doing here? What do you see as your fit, or whatever the question is, right? That standard question that you always get in interviews. The people who say, well, I really want to change the way things work in prisons. That's kind of like, oh, have you read anything about us? Because this thing's been around for 100 years and it's a cruise ship. It's not necessarily going to turn in my lifetime, but it's a slow, long game. And I say game not because we're playing, but it's a long game, right? You're setting up a long timeline of things that will follow you. But you have to recognize the size of the role you can play today versus down the road as well. Dress for the job you want, and being respectful and sensitive to people. That's stuff that, like, I'm building a team. Since my arrival, I've had a few retirements, and I think COVID has gotten a lot of people to get there that were already eligible. And so we had quite a few openings that we've been filling since I arrived. And I want to make sure the team I build is one that is collaborative and doesn't silo. And I think that kind of speaks to the generation of people coming out of school right now. They're people who are collaborators. They are people who want to work with others. They don't want to sit in an office with the door shut and think for them the one thing all the time and have no interaction on it. That's an old model, and it's not a good model, in my opinion. I don't like silos. I actually cross-pollinate on our teams constantly. It's important, because humility, you got to realize you don't know everything, and someone else with fresh eyes who knows less than you might have a great answer. They just know different. You have to know that. So I don't know. There's so many ways to answer that question too. The hard skills and the soft skills are both important.
Well, I think that's about our time, but thank you so much. And I'm sure that I know folks were a little bit shy in the chat and in the Q&A, but can folks reach out to you after this? I know we've talked about the importance of networking, so.
Absolutely. I think there's probably questions that didn't get asked, and I 100% am behind, responding to folks and talking to folks and giving them ideas. Because if you're interested in working in government or any other field that's AltAc, talking to people who work in those fields can at least tell you the keyword searches to use. And to Ashley's point, when I met her, we were talking about how if there's a job that you see as your goal job, go on LinkedIn, go on Indeed, find people who have that job and look at what they did, because all of us are very good at overeducating ourselves. But do we have the right experience or skill set? Should we go get a project management certificate because the person in that job had one and it made them successful? Like, that's the stuff. It's not necessarily, let me just get more school, because that's not always enough. Because that's what I tried. It was not enough. I needed to do the experiences too.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining.
That's right. And I appreciate you coming. We'll have at least 2 more Rockstar webinars this year, which is super exciting. Our next one is someone who currently works for the United Nations and lives abroad, doing really, really thoughtful work, also a Rutgers alum. Y'all really just doing the most over there. And then we'll also be featuring someone from CNA who also lives in the DC area, that does training and technical assistance work, which isn't something we've really talked a lot about here, but super exciting, because as people are growing up in graduate programs and really connected to teaching and you don't want to necessarily leave it, moving from a university setting teaching to training and technical assistance might actually be a really like well-suited fit for you, particularly if you love educating, if you love like the aha moments, right? And so we're really excited to have someone from CNA who helps lead and really started and developed a very large training and technical assistance portfolio over there, primarily funded by grant funds out of BJA. So really excited that's at the end of the summer. And so stay tuned for continued flyers for both of those Rockstar researchers who are doing really, really incredible work in the field.
So I dropped my email in there in capital letters because sometimes when people see it, they think that the L is an I.
Okay.
So I just dropped it there in capital letters so you can see where that L is in my last name. You'd be surprised.
Fair enough. I super appreciate that. Well, thank you so much, Ellen, and thank you all for who attended, and be on the lookout for future Rockstar webinars.
Thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate it. And I do mean it when I say feel free to reach out. I won't always respond right away, but I will respond.
Awesome. Thanks all.